Hello, good people, and welcome to Finance Skills Hub. Here we learn, we connect, and we grow. Excel dashboards are fun, but to create them, you don't really need complex formulas and functions. In this case study, we want to show you how you can use pivot tables, Power Query, and Power Pivot to be able to bring two data sets or more together, modify, model, and create simple aggregations to create a fully interactive dashboard. In this case study, we want to use these tools to create a personal finance dashboard that allows us to track our actual and budget numbers. This video is a step-by-step video, so open up your Excel and let's go through it together. So here's our final work, a personal finance dashboard that allows us to see how much came in, how much we spent, and then our net position at the end of the period. We also have a trend that gives us how the net position was month on month in the year. Then we are going to learn how to create this waterfall chart. Basically, it tells you the income position and then how the breakdown of the different class of expenses brought you to your final net position. Okay, it also calculates how much you spent for any particular period of time. Now, what we've used in this dashboard is a very creative way to use data bars, okay, to allow us to compare our budget and actuals side by side, right? So on this side, you have your budget numbers, okay, broken down into income and expenses, and then you have your actual numbers also on the side, right? Of course, this is not static, so you can slice them month on month. So you can go and then check how much you spent in each month, clear to have the full period, right? If you want to zoom in to only your expenses, you could also do that. And then if you want to zoom into only your income, you can also do that. And then you have the two, right? So overall, even if you are using this for your personal finance management, the idea is that if you have two data sets or more, you can use these tools to be able to accomplish a dashboard like this. So this is an overview. Let's go through and then I'll introduce my data sets to you. Okay, so we'll begin with just two data sets. The first one captures our transactions, right? So just 4 columns. I have my date, the description, the category of my expense or my income, and the amount. Now, the notable thing here is that for expenses, all the outflows are negated, and then for our income lines, we have them as positive, right? We've adopted this convention to be able to get our net position when we aggregate, right? Now, if we go to the budget side, it's a similar layout, but this is more horizontal, is wider. So this layout covers the 12 months in a year, okay? So for each line, you see the category, the class, and then the type, right? We add these things so that you can have slicers to be able to break down your calculations. Again, in this layout, you realize that our expenses are also negated. Okay, we also have a control account. Usually we move money in between accounts. At the end of the period, we expect this control account to be 0, right? That is what we have here as transfer. Then our income lines are also here. So essentially for each month, we can put in the amount that we want to spend and then the amount that we expect to receive, right? Now, what we need to do basically is we are going to make sure that our actual table and our budget table are similar in terms of orientation. We'll connect them and then use these attributes, category, class, and then type to be able to break down all the calculations that we need from our actual and budget table. Simply, that is our task. So we are going to go through Power Query, Power Pivot, and then Pivot Tables. And then once we are done, we use our charts and slicers to finish our dashboard. So we are going to begin first by converting this into a table. So I'll go to insert and then insert a table on this. The reason you are doing this is to make it easier to reference the data in the entire space, right? Tables allow us to do what we call structured referencing. So you don't have to mouse over every time. So the name I'm going to give to this is actual. Okay, then I'll go to budget, stand in here, go to insert, and then also insert a table. Shortcut is Control T if you want. So I will insert this as well. This I'm going to name budget, right? So we now have 2 tables, actual and budget. So the next thing we're going to do is to take these 2 tables to Power Query, right? Our goal is to ensure that the budget table and the transactions table are similar in terms of structure, right? So we will now go load this into Power Query. So I'm standing in the table, and to load to Power Query, I'll go to data, right? You see get data on the far left. So this is from table. So I'm going to use the from table / range icon, and then this will load it into Power Query. So I'm currently in Power Query, and this is the table that has been loaded. You realize that my columns are here, and then the name of the table is here. Usually when you come into Power Query, you need to be sure that the data types are correct, right? So these are the data types in the top left corner, right? For this, we want to make it a date instead of a date and time. So I replace that step. Description is text is fine. Category is text is also fine. And then I have my amount, right? So I'm really not going to make any changes here. Now let's bring in our budget table. So we don't step out. What we want to do is click on the source step. Okay, this is the step that brought in the data, right? This is the formula, the M code. So you copy this, Control C. Okay, we are going to launch a blank query. So to launch a blank query, you can go to new source, okay, other sources, and then here you have your blank query, right? So I'm going to paste what I copied. Now the reason you named the table is to be able to modify formulas like this with just names. So instead of actual, you can put in budget, okay, to bring in the budget table. So I press enter. This is my budget table, right? So I'm going to name this budget, right? So here, what we want to do basically is first to make sure that we have our category, class, type in the respective columns. And then in the last 12 columns, you realize that the orientation is more horizontal, right? So we want these placed in just 2 columns for dates and then the amount, similar to our transactions table, right? To be able to do that, we are going to use a process called on-pivoting. So on-pivoting collapses columns and then turns them into rows, right? So to do that, I'll select just the first 3 columns, right? These ones are fine. And then I'll right click and then I'll choose on-pivot other columns. Okay, so this way I now have all my dates in one column labeled attributes and then my amounts in the other column called values. Now, you'll notice that my dates are currently formatted as text ABC, right? So if I attempt to format it as a proper date, right, here it is treating my years as days. Okay, so this is not going to be helpful. So I'm going to reverse that step. I'll take off this step. Now, basically what we need to do is for this to be recognized as an accurate date, we need to add a prefix for the day, right? So this is just month and year, right? So in Power Query, you can make all these transformations. So selecting attributes, I'll come to transform, okay? And then under format, I have the option to add a prefix, right? So I'll click add prefix. Now the prefix is just going to be 01 dash, okay? That way we begin on the 1st of every month for our budget. So I'm going to do that. So you realize that now the prefix has been added. I can now go back and then format this as a date. So I can now go back and do this properly. So I now have my date format as it should be. Okay, so we have our category, class, type, attributes. This is going to be called dates. So I'll double click and call this. Okay, now for amount, we'll name it amount, right? So we have it as negative and positive, right? So now if you look at the 2 tables, in terms of orientation, they are now close. Okay, now we need a slicer that can control these 2 tables so that when we click on, let's say, type expense, both tables can respond. So to be able to do that, I'm going to draw a dimension table that just has the categories, the class, and then the type, right? Thankfully, we have this in the budget table. So category, class, and type are here, right? So I'm going to reference this original table. I'll right click and then I'll choose reference. Reference basically creates a copy of that table and then maintains a connection to that so that any change can also flow into the table that you have created. So this is going to be called the categories table, right? Basically what we need here is just the category, class, and type. So I'll highlight these 3, right click, and remove all other columns, right? Now because of the on-pivoting, we have duplicates here. So while these 3 columns are highlighted, you can right click and remove duplicates, So after drawing the unique list of categories, the corresponding class and type would come along, right? So this is going to be our dimension table. So we just completed our transformation for our tables. We now have our actual and budget fact tables where we do our calculations, and then we'll draw our slices and any other filters from our categories table. So the next step is to load this into the data model in Power Pivot. To do that, I'll come to Home, right? Come to Close and Load and choose the second option, Close and Load To, right? So this way I have the option to add it to the data model, which is very important, and then save it as a connection, right? So you check these two, okay, and then I'll click OK. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to help us connect or relate the tables using common relationships. Okay, so this will now complete our ETL in Power Query. Now let's go to Power Pivot. So again, if you are using Power Pivot for the first time, you have to enable it. If it's already enabled, you see it as a tab sitting on your command tabs list. Okay, if you're using it for the first time, you can enable it by coming to Data, right? In the Data Tools group, you can use the data model icon here. You click it for the first time, it opens up Power Pivot, you close it. After, you see Power Pivot here, right? So let's go into Power Pivot. The expectation is that once I click Manage in Power Pivot, this is the Power Pivot environment where all my three tables are: actual, budget, and categories. I am in the data view, right? So here I see the data in the columnar presentation. Apart from data view, you can also view it in the diagram view. Okay, so this one gives you a schema or a visual presentation of all the tables, right? Usually, where we calculate from is called a fact table. So this is my actual and my budget table. And then the table that allows us to break down or use slices is our dimension table. For the case study we are going to use, we'll be breaking down using categories, but I also want to break down using dates, months as well, right? In Power Pivot, you can create your full calendar table. So to do that, I am going into Design, okay? Then I have my table, right? Then I'll use this new icon here. This will create a calendar table from beginning to end, right? So this is also going to be my dimension table. So now that I have this, the next step is to connect these tables together. So we basically look out for the common columns between each table, right? So if you compare calendar and actual, okay, dates is the common one. So I'll connect this. So this date has a unique list. This one can have multiple dates, right? So we call this the primary key and we call this the foreign key, right? So I have a one-to-many relationship over here. Then I can also connect category to categories using the common column category and category. Again, I have a one-to-many, right? So this way, it means I can use slices that can control the tables that I have connected. Let's do same for budget. So for budget, I come here category to category. Okay, so this is a one-to-many. And then for my dates, I can also use dates on calendar. So I'll use date to date. Okay, so with my dimension tables and fact tables connected, it means if I insert a pivot table, I have access to all these tables to do my aggregations or my charts. Now that we finished our data model, let's now exit and then start creating our pivot tables. Okay, so we've connected our tables. I'm going to insert a new sheet, which I'm going to call calculations, even though they are really not going to be calculations, but just simple aggregations, right? Now, let me take you to our final work. So if you look at our final work, the basic calculations that we need are our inflows, our outflows, our net position. These we can create with pivot tables, okay? Then we'll create a pivot table that analyzes our actual numbers by month. Then we also create same that analyzes our amount by class, okay? Then another that summarizes our budget and actual numbers by category. Once you're able to create this backstage, it's going to drive all the display that you see in our dashboard, right? So that is how we are going to proceed. Now, because we have a data model, I can insert a pivot table directly by going to Insert, Pivot Table, and then I have the option to insert from the data model. So I'll click, and then I have the new worksheet, existing worksheet options. I'll choose existing worksheet, and then I'll click OK. So this is my pivot table. So you notice that the tables that were loaded in the data model are up here, Okay, so these are the ones we are going to use. These two are the original data sets that you started with. Okay, so for our first analysis, we want to take the amount column, okay, which is just the net position from the outflows and inflows in our actual, right? So I'll take this and move it to the values position. So this gives me 12,612. Now, I want to break this down by inflows and outflows, right? To be able to do that, I'll come to my categories, which is our dimension table, right? And then put type in rows, okay? So when I do that, it breaks it down, giving me income and expense, right? So if you look at it closely, all the numbers that we need for the first three tiles in our final work are here, right? If you like, you can sort this. Okay, so I'll come to data and then sort this. So I have my income, my expense, and my net position. So this is what we are going to use for these tiles, okay? Now, next up, let's now create a similar pivot table that analyzes our actual numbers by month. Okay, so to do that, I can go to Insert, come to Pivot Table from the data model, again choose my existing worksheet, and then I'll click OK. So over here, I'll come to Actual and then push Amount to the Value section, but I want to break this down by month. So I'll come to my calendar. Here I have a date hierarchy, so if I open up, I get more fields, right? What I'm interested in is the month, so I'll push my month over here. So this gives me a breakdown of the same net position 12612 this time around by month. This is what we are going to use for our trend chart, right? So this is what we are going to use for our trend chart. We want to make it very simple. So we basically want to extract just the first characters of each month and then plot our actual numbers, right? So to make that possible, we'll create a mirror of our pivot table, okay, and then use that to plot our chart. So I'm going to use Excel's flash fill, okay, which is basically going to use the pattern in the months and then extract just the first characters. Now to be able to use the flash fill, I'm just going to highlight the next blank column after the pivot table and put in any placeholder. It can be X, okay, and then press Ctrl Enter, right? So this way, if I suggest that I want J, okay, and then F, okay, if I press Ctrl E, you notice that it's able to now detect that I need these values, okay. Then I can now reference the corresponding amounts and then drag these down, okay. So Ctrl D, so this is going to be my month, and then these are going to be my amounts, okay. So I can take off my grand total. Now, to always ensure that our pivot table doesn't fold up when we use slicers, we can make sure that all values show whether we use slicers or not. To be able to do that, I will stand in the pivot table, go to pivot table analyze, then under options, this is options, right? So if I come to display, I just need to check the box show items with no data on rows. So this way we are sure that our 12 months would always display. Okay, so now that we are done with this, let's insert our first chart. So I'm going to highlight this, okay, go to insert, and then we are going to use the area chart. So if you like, you can come to all charts and then use this area chart. So this is the chart we are going to use, okay. So this is our area chart. We want to keep it simple. So I'll take off all the unnecessary details. Basically, we just want the trend. Okay, I'll take off the grid lines. Okay, now for our fill, I'll press Ctrl 1. Okay, so Ctrl 1 allows you to access the settings for your chart. For the fill, use a solid fill, but we'll use this faint blue here. Okay, so this is going to be for the fill. And then our border is going to be a bit deeper. So we'll come to our border lines and then use a solid line. Okay, now all we need to do is increase the width to about 2. Okay, so this is going to be for our trend. Okay, so we'll have this chart on standby. Later we'll come for it and then use it in our dashboard. So that's how we're going to be proceeding. So we create the pivot tables, we create a corresponding chart, and then later we just put it all together in one nice dashboard. So basically, we've just covered the pivot tables for our inflows, our outflows, our net position, and our trend, right? Let's now create the pivot table for comparing our budget and actual numbers by category. So again, to be able to create that, we'll go to insert, okay, pivot table from the data model, okay, from this existing worksheet, okay. So over here, we are comparing budget and actual, right? So I'll come to my budget table and then put amount in the value section. Then I'll come to my actual table and also bring my amount here. To be able to differentiate, okay, you're allowed to rename the headers. Okay, so let me call this budget and then I'll call this actual. All right. Now, basically, we want to break this down by categories. Okay, so I'll come to my categories table, right? Always ensure that for whatever you are breaking down with, it comes from the category dimension table. We want to break this down by category, right? So I'll push this into rows. So I now have my actual and budget comparison, right? Now, there are some few things that we need to do here. If you look at our final presentation, we want our income lines to be on top, followed by our expense lines. We also don't want the transfer line over here, right? So we'll make those changes quickly. So to be able to do that, we want to sort by budget, okay? So that the positive numbers will come on top and then the negative numbers will go below. I'll click on this filter icon, okay? And then you have more sort options here. Here, I have the option to sort by descending order. So I'll drop this and then sort this by budget and I'll click OK. Okay, so this way you notice that I have my budget and actual numbers side by side. My income lines are now on top. I want to also take out the transfer, right? We can do that by taking it off here, right? So we'll just filter this out, okay? And then we have something like this, okay? Or if you don't want it to appear at all, you could also take it out from the Power Query side, okay? So this is the staging for our budgets and our actual, right? So basically what we want to do is for this one, we'll just be referencing these numbers and then we'll put our data labels on it. Okay, so now that this is done, let's go to our final staging, which is the staging for our waterfall chart. So for our waterfall chart, we are basically analyzing our actual amount by our class, right? So we have expense classes, which is basically about 5, right? So to be able to do that, I'll come in here, insert a pivot table from the data model again, and then place it right here. Okay, so over here, I'll go to actual and then put in my amount in the value section, come to my categories table, and then I'll put in class, right? So this is how the class breaks down our actual amount. Now this I can sort, okay, so that I have the income on top and the expenses down, right? The thing with waterfall chart is you cannot use it directly on pivot tables. So again, we are going to maintain the display of the pivot table by going to pivot table analyze, come to options, okay, and then for our display, we would ensure that it shows items with no data on rows. Okay, so when we do this, you realize that our transfer line pops up again, right? For learning, let's learn how to do this permanently in Power Query, right? So we want a situation where the transfer doesn't even come up at all, right? So let's go back to Power Query. An easier way to go back to Power Query is to go to data, right? Your queries and connections. Okay, so over here, you can go back to your Power Query by double clicking any of the queries. Now, what we want to do is permanently take off transfers, right? So if I come to budget, right, this is where I drew my category table from. So here, if I come to the class and then look out for transfer, I basically want to take off transfer so it doesn't appear at all. So I'm adding this as a step, right? So that's the power of Power Query. Every step here now flows directly into all your aggregations, so you don't have to do it over and over again, right? When I close and apply, you notice that on refresh, the transfer will not pop up at all, which even makes what we did earlier unnecessary. So if I come to my pivot table and then I refresh all, right, I don't expect transfer to pop up again. right? So you appreciate why Power Query is important. If you create all your modifications in Power Query, right, you don't have to do them over and over again. So hopefully you have learned different ways to make modifications to your data using Power Query, right? So this is going to be our display. So I'll come in here and then reference my labels. Okay, so this is going to be my label. Okay, and then again, I'm going to reference the amount over here. So this is always going to maintain this shape, right? So let me call this class and I'll call this amount, right? So this is the mirror data for our waterfall chart. Usually the waterfall chart requires a net position. So I'm going to extend this to include the grand total. Okay, this I'm going to call net. Okay, so I can now highlight this, go to insert, and then put in the recommended charts. I normally like to start off with recommended charts. Okay, at least you can go through the suggestions, right? So I'll use this one, the waterfall chart, and I'll click OK. Okay, so this is going to be our waterfall chart. We'll make some changes here. We'll take off the chart title. Okay, we'll take off these labels on the left. Now, the position that we have here is our net position, which is technically our total, right? So I'll just click on that alone twice to select that, right click, and then set this as total. Okay, so this way we now have our nice display. So we'll make the final modifications when we go to our dashboard. Okay, so this is going to be our waterfall chart. So now that we've set the stage for our dashboard, let's do one final calculation, which is the percentage that we have spent. So the basic calculation for this is going to be my expense, which is already negated. So to make it absolute, I'll negate it here as well. Bring my division sign and then select income, right? So this is going to give me 87%, Control Shift percentage, right? Now to be able to create that donut chart, I need the remainder, right? So just here, I'll do an equal to 1 minus this. Okay, so these two would always give me my 100%, right? So this is going to be the staging for my percentage spent. Of course, here we are assuming that you don't have an overdraft, right? So you always spend within the 100%. So this is the complete staging for our dashboard. Now that we have this, let's start work on our dashboard. So just a quick check-in to see how you are doing. So far, I hope you appreciate how you can use Power Query to modify or make changes to your data, Power Pivot to connect tables so you don't have to do complex lookup formulas and all that. Then PivotTables to create aggregations. But if you probably need measures, right, you can use DAX and also use cube functions as well. I cover all this in my book, Data Modeling with Microsoft Excel. I've shared a link here. You can grab a copy on Amazon. It comes with practice files, which allows you to build a fully comprehensive sales dashboard using all these tools. So probably after creating this dashboard, you want more practice, I encourage you to get the book. In the meantime, let's go ahead and then finish our dashboard. Okay, so let's begin our dashboard. As usual, there are a few considerations to make your work easier. The first thing is to create what we call a mockup or a wireframe. That way you know where to place each metric or indicator, right? We also need to maintain a consistent font. So let's take this through step by step. As usual, you need to pay attention to the columns you are going to use as margins, right? So column A, G, K, O, and S, right? So A, G, K, O, and S is going to be used as your margins, making it easier for your user to separate the objects in your dashboard. So let's do that. I'm going to add a new sheet and I'm going to call this dashboard. Okay, so I'll select A, G, K, Control select O, and then S, right? So Control select each of these, then you come to Home, okay, then Format, you can set the column width, okay, to 2, right? So that's the first thing that I do. The thing with dashboards is that it's not cast in stone, right? You can modify as you go, but the wireframe or mockup allows you to set a good foundation for this. Now that I've done this, I want to highlight the whole thing and then set my font. So for our dashboard, we are maintaining the new font type in Office, Aptos Narrow, right? I'm just going to use a font 10 for this. Okay, so this is going to ensure that your fonts are consistent, right? So now that we've done this, if you look at our final work, we have basically about 6 sections, right? So these cards, right, 4 of these, and then we have our background for the charts, and then we create a staging for our budget and actual comparison, right? So let's create a mockup for this. So this one starts from H10 all the way to J16. Okay, so I'll start from H10 all the way to J16. So over here, after I've selected this, right, you put outside borders. Okay, then you just repeat the process for the corresponding ones. So I'll highlight the next one. Okay, this is from L9 to N16. Just do F4 to repeat that last action. Okay, and then I'll do same for this one, F4, and then this is going to be for our final trend, another F4, right? So this is going to be the mockup for our first 4 cards. The next one is for the background for our waterfall. So the mockup for our waterfall charts will now stretch from H21 to R21, right? So based on our final work, I'm using the same dimensions. Okay, so another F4 to do that, and then we'll have our donut charts taking this space. Okay, so that is how we are going to lay this out. So the staging for our budget and actual will now take this stage. Okay, so I'll do another F4 here, right? When you lay it out like this, it's easier. So after creating your mockup, the next thing is to create a very soft background. Because we are designing in, if you like, white mode, we need a way to contrast our cards, okay, or our shapes, right? So we need just a soft version of gray. Now, in an earlier video, I showed you how you could use this one, the 5% darker, to be able to do that. So in this case study, we've modified it a bit, right? So you can also use this one. So I'm going to share the hex code. I've copied it. So I'm going to highlight the whole of this, come to my fill, okay, and then go to more colors, custom, and then paste this hex code, right? So you can see the hex code on the screen, EDF2FA, right? So this will give me that soft gray background. That way my white shapes can contrast nicely. Okay, so we've now set out the background for our dashboards. Now let's put in our shapes. I'll go to insert, come to illustrations, shape. I'm using this rounded corners rectangle, right? So usually when you are drawing your shape, hold the Alt key so that it snaps to the edges, right? So this is going to be the first shape. I'll go ahead and format this and then just duplicate it for the rest. For the shape fill is going to be white, okay? There's going to be no outline. And then for my shape effects, I'll come to shadows, right? And go to more shadow options. Okay, so this way I will set the first bottom right shadow option, okay, and then for the color I'll choose the third shade, which is a 25% darker. Okay, so this is how the shape is going to be. So now that I have this, I can now slide, select, Control Shift, select, and then you can slide it to make sure that it's aligned. Okay, so this is going to come in here, Control Shift, slide, select, okay, and then Control Shift, select, slide. Okay, this maintains the alignment, right? And then I'll do a Control D to copy and then lay this one out holding the Alt key, right? Just to make sure it just snaps to the grid. Okay, so basically this is the layout for all the shapes that we are going to use, right? Now let's bring in our calculations, right? So to bring in the calculations from the pivot table into this shape, you first have to select the shape, okay, and then place an equal sign in your formula bar. Go to your calculations page. So here we are bringing in our inflows. So you select the inflows and then you press enter. So if you get an error during this process, basically what you need to do is to turn off the get pivot data option. You can do that by standing in the pivot table, come to pivot table analyze, right? Under options, just uncheck generate get pivot data, right? So that would allow you to directly reference your numbers. Okay, so if you have done that, let's come back to our dashboard. So for our display, I basically want this to be bold. So the recommended font I use is Berlin Sun. Okay, you can increase it to about 28. Okay, center and middle align, right? So this is going to be our display for our inflows. Now let's deal with the formatting. While we are here, I basically want all of the numbers to display as absolute numbers, right? So especially for the outflow, I don't want any negative numbers. So I'm going to apply one consistent formatting that would first give me a comma separator and then also neutralize the negative numbers in the pivot table. To be able to do that, I will right click and then go to number format. Okay, and over here I'll come to custom, right? So basically what I need to do is, if you're formatting numbers using the custom format, there are 4 sections separated by 3 semicolons, right? So the first one is positive, the next section is negative, the next one is 0, and then the final one is how text is displayed, right? This format is a comma separated number. That is for positive. Okay, so if I want the same thing to display on the negative side, I'll bring a semicolon. Okay, copy this, Control C, and then paste this on the negative side, right? Because I'm just dealing with positive and negative, I'll just leave this and then I'll click OK, right? So you notice that this has achieved 2 things, brought in my commas and then also neutralized my negative numbers for my expense. So after this is done, I can now come in and then reference my outflows. So this is my outflow, and then let me do same for my net position. So I'll come in here and then do for my net position as well. Okay, so if I have these two, I can just select the first one, double click this format painter, and then just touch this and touch that, right? So this will now complete my inflows, outflows, and net position. Okay, now let's bring in our trend chart, which I've already calculated. So I'll come to my calculations, select this, and then cut. All right, I'll come to my dashboard and then try and fit this in the space that I have allotted for myself. Okay, so I'll just squeeze this in here. Right, so the way we've done this, just ensure that when you fit the chart, you take off the outline for the chart, right? And then make sure the edges are inside the rounded parts, okay? So that it doesn't overlap your background, okay? So in the end, you have something like this. Later, we'll just erase all the marks in the background and you have your clean background. Okay, so we've created this. Now let's bring in our waterfall charts, which we have already in our pivot table, and then cut, Control X, come to my dashboard and then fit this over here. Trend, right? We'll fit this nicely, ensuring that the corners stay in a rounded area. And then once we are done, we'll just take off the shape outline. Okay, so later we'll deal with the colors to ensure that it aligns with our theme. Okay, so we now have our waterfall charts. Let's quickly create our donut charts. So for our donut charts, we can come to our calculations. We have already set the staging for that, right? So I'll just highlight these two, the 12% and the 88%, go to insert, and then insert this donut chart over here, right? Take off the chart title, take off these labels, and then cut the donut charts and then bring it to my dashboard. Okay, so for the donut charts, we are really not using any backdrop. Okay, so we just fit it directly in here. All right, so let's format our donut chart. For our donut chart, we'll click on format. First, in the shape fill, we'll choose no fill to make it transparent. And then for our rings, I'll select the first one, select it again, press Ctrl 1. Okay, so this gives me the option to format. For my border lines, I'm not going to use any border lines, so I'll choose no line. So the part that I've selected is the part that has been spent, right? So we want to use a solid fill color for this, right? So for our dashboard, our theme is this blue that we have here, the dark teal accent one, right? So we use this one for the spent part. So when I'm done with that, I'll select the remainder, right? So for that one, we are going to make that part white, okay? And ensure that there's no border line, right? It wouldn't even matter because both are white. right? So this is going to be our donut chart, right? So the final thing that we'll do with our donut chart is to take off the borderlines. Okay, so we'll take off the borderlines for our donut chart. So once we are done with this, we'll bring in the label for the amount that we have spent, which is 88%. Now to do that, we'll just insert a text box. So I'll come to insert, right, a text box over here. So I'll just draw a nice text box in the middle. So this is my text box. It's going to be my placeholder. So I'll select it, go to my formula bar, put in an equal sign, come to my calculations, and then I'll put in 88%, right? Maintain the same font type. I'll choose Berlin Sun for this, center, middle, align, and then increase this to about 20%, okay? So this is going to be for the label. So while we are here, I'll select the shape format, choose no fill, and then choose no borderline, okay? So our complete donut chart looks something like this, very clean, right? Okay, so for our donut chart, you can make it a bit slimmer, right? So if you don't want a big ring, you can select the ring, press Ctrl 1, and then increase the donut hole size to about 85%. So that gives you a very slim display, okay? Okay, so we are almost there. So the last thing we need to do is to bring in the staging for our budget and actual comparison against categories, right? So for that, I'm going to stand in D10, okay, bring in an equal to, come to my calculations, and then first select my salary. Okay, so here, I'll just copy this down, Control D. Don't worry about the borderlines for now, we'll deal with all that, right? I'll double click the column D to just fit in all the labels, okay? Then I'll bring in my budget. So for my budget, I'll bring in an equal sign, go to my calculations, and then I'll fit this in. So I'll select this, go all the way down, and then do a Control D for that. And then you do same for my actual. So I'll come to actual, select this, press enter, and then copy this down. Okay. Now these numbers that we have referenced are what we are going to use for our data labels. Okay. So I'm going to work on just this part, and then I'll just use the formats and apply it to this part. So if you look closely, for our positive numbers, we have our green bars, and then for our negative numbers, we are going to have our red. Okay, so I'm going to highlight these, come to home, and then conditional formatting, and I have data bars here, right? So this is actually what we want, but I want to make some modifications. So I'm going to go to more rules. Okay, now here we can set the color for positive and negative, right? So by default, the solid fill color is showing blue. So here you can change it to green or any color that you want. You can also modify the negative value axis, which is currently set to red. Okay, so you can leave that as it is, right? So there are two reasons I came to this dialog box. First, we want to show only the bars, right? We don't want the numbers to show. Now, secondly, I also want to make a little adjustment because the 60,000, which is the highest value, is too far off the highest expense, which is negative 8,000. I need to make a little modification to the maximum display, right? So that at least we can have a little bit of the red display and then some of the green, right? So instead of setting this to automatic, I'm going to use on the maximum side a formula, right? So the formula is basically going to be the highest in the range, which is this 60,000, and then I'm going to divide this by 5. So that way we'll have a little bit of the red showing when we put in the conditional formatting, right? So I'll click OK. So this is what we have, okay? So here I'll highlight the whole of this. It's the same formatting I'm going to use on the right side. So I'll take this and then just brush it over this one. Okay, so this will now give me the comparison of my budgets and then my actual numbers. But we need to see the numbers, right? Even though we've hidden them, we can still reference, right? So I'm going to stand in B10 and then reference this side, which gives me 60,000, right? If I copy this down, you notice that it gives me the positive and negative display. If you don't want that, you can run a function ABS around this. Okay, so I can just make this positive by running the ABS function around this, and then I'll just Control D. Okay, so we'll do same for this one as well. So ABS, select this one, and then I'll copy this down. So I'll format this nicely, highlight all of it, press Ctrl Shift 1 for the comma separator. If you want to get rid of the decimals, you can do Alt H9, Alt H9. Press them one after the other, right? Then I'll do same for this one as well. Ctrl Shift 1, Alt H9, Alt H9, right? So this is now the display that you have over here, right? Now we can now take off our mockup lines. Okay, so I'll just highlight the whole of this, come here and then choose no borders. Okay, so we now have our clean display. Okay, now we are going to be using slicers, right? So the first slicer that we are going to use is the type slicer, and then we also use the slicer that allows us to select our month, right? So let's bring in our slicers. So I'll come to insert, then insert the slicer. Now because I have the data model, I can choose it directly from the data model. So I'll click open. My sliders are coming from the dimension tables. Always take note, right? So I'm going to select month from the calendar table, and then for my categories, I will use type for income or expense. Okay, so these are going to be my two slicers. Thankfully, the default display of the slicers matches our theme, right? So we'll make a little modification to the colors and we should be fine. So for our slicers, we'll split this into two. So I'll select this, come to slicer, and then split this into two columns. And then I'll position this nicely. And then come to our month, and then also split this into 12 months. Now, you will notice that our display of the full months is taking up space, right? So we'll rather choose the abbreviated version, right? Earlier, I showed you how to go back to Power Query. Now let's learn how to go back to Power Pivot to make modifications. So what we want to do basically is for that month display, we want to modify it to show only the 3 characters, right? So let's go to Power Pivot. You click on Power Pivot, right? You go back to Manage. Okay, so this is where we have our calendar, right? Now, these columns were created using DAX formulas, right? So if you click on any, you notice that the formulas are displayed in the formula bar. This is what is giving us the full month display, right? So in the month, instead of 4 M's, we can just back off 1, okay? Press enter, and then we have the abbreviated version, right? So the expectation is now, if I go back, you see that it has modified my labels, but then there's another problem. It hasn't sorted it chronologically. Again, to help with the learning, let's see how we fix this. So we'll go back to Power Pivot, go back to Manage. Okay, we basically need to be able to sort this month, which we just modified, okay, by the month number. So I'll select this, come to sort by column, right? And then I'll choose month number, and then I'll click OK, right? So this should resolve that second problem, right? So if I come in here, you notice that this has been properly ordered. Okay, so at this point, let's connect our slicers. Now, what we basically want is that if I select month, I want it to control some aspects of this dashboard. So first, I want it to break down my outflows, inflows, and net position. I also want it to break down my waterfall charts, right? I also want it to break down this and also break down this part, but I don't want it to break down my trend, right? So to be able to do that, it makes sense to know which pivot tables you are connecting to, right? So let's go back and name our pivot tables. Okay, so I have this pivot table here. So the name for this pivot table, let's call this one summary. Okay, this pivot table is going to be my trend, right? This pivot table is going to be, you can give it any name that makes it easier to remember, right? I can call this data bars, okay? And then this is going to be my waterfall. So now that you have these in mind, you can come to your dashboard. Now you can connect the right slicers, right? So let's start with the type. So I'll right click and I'll come to report connections, right? So first, I want this to be able to control the data bars. Okay, I don't want it to control the summary, right? Because it's income and expense. If you do that, only income or expense will display, and that's not going to be good. Okay, so I also wanted to filter my trend. Okay, so I basically wanted to filter my data bars and also filter my trends, right? So again, it's a story you are telling. So you just need to make sure that the right slices are connected to the right pivot tables. So if you realize that the slicer is going to distort that story, then you can disconnect it, right? So I'll click OK. So let's see how this works. So if I click on income, I see only income. If I click on expense, I see only expense. If I click on the two, right, you notice that I have my net positions. So that's how this works, right? Later we'll deal with the zeros that are showing over here. Now let's do same for our month slicer. So I'll come to report connections. So first we want it to control our data bars. We want it to control our summary, but we don't want it to control our trend. Okay, and then we also want it to control our waterfall. So I'll click OK. So over here, when I click, you realize that it's able to slice as it should. Okay, so that's how we connect these. So we're almost there. Now let's deal with the final touches. So let's format our slicer. So basically what we want to achieve is we want the background of our slicer to be the same as the background of our dashboard, right? And then we'll take off the border lines. So I'll click on the slicer, go to the slicer tab, right click on this and then duplicate because we want to create our own version. So I'll call this Finex, and then in this whole slicer, this is where we are going to format the color, right? So I'll come to the format, okay, go to the fill. Okay, so here is currently showing no color, right? So I'll come to more colors, come to custom, and then put in the background that we have, right? You remember the hex code that we used earlier? So I'll copy mine from the clipboard. Okay, so this is going to be the background for this. Now for our borderline, we can choose not to show our borderline and then we'll maintain the font, right? So that is for the whole slicer. So as I mentioned, this is the only modification that we are going to do. So I'm going to click OK. Then I'll come to my slicer and now activate this new one that I have brought in. Okay, so this is going to be the new slicer. And it shows that it just sits nicely in the background. Okay, so let's also touch our final waterfall charts, right, in terms of the colors. So increase is going to be green. To make it easier to color, you can use the legend, right? So if you click twice on the legend, I can simply come to home and then use the fill color directly, right? So this is green. Then I'll move to decrease, use the same option. Okay, so I'll choose this red. And then for my total, which is my net position, I can choose blue. If you look at the display of our data bars, when we choose a particular type, income or expense, we have these zeros that are trailing, right? Not really nice. So let's find a way to make the space blank instead of showing zeros, right? So to do that, I can highlight the whole of this, okay, and then press Ctrl 1. So again, we are going to use a custom format over here, right? So that custom format basically is not going to show anything for zeros, okay? So we'll maintain this display for the positive numbers, bring in a semicolon, right? And then copy and paste this display, okay, for the negative numbers, and then bring in a semicolon. Because we want to make the zeros blank, we'll just skip it. So I'll just put another semicolon over here. But for what we have selected, we also have text. So I'll bring an @ sign for the text, right? So this is going to be the display that will take care of the redundant zeros, okay? So if I click OK, now let's test this and see. If I click only income, we have a blank space. If I click only expense, we have this, okay? So this will make sure that that staging is always clean. Now we also want border lines, right? So we want some faint border lines to just make it easier on the eye. So one last conditional formatting we are going to use is to show border lines if the value in the budget section is greater than 0. right? At least that's one logic that we can use. So I'll come home, conditional formatting, set a new rule, right? And then use a formula to do this rule, right? The formula is basically going to be simple. I'll select the up arrow, select the 60,000, okay? Now I want this to apply to all the subsequent rows, right? The dollar signs apply to B and 10. So what you can do is that you can take off the dollar sign against 10 so that it can go down and make it a relative reference, right? So $B10 is greater than 0. This is where we want the line to be applied, right? So if this is true, then we can apply the format. So the format we want is a border, right? So a border with just faint blue. We choose the line, which is this line. Remember to choose that line, and then we'll click OK. Right, so if I click OK, you notice that I have my blue lines. If I choose only income, it doesn't show. It shows only for the income lines, right? If I remove the filters, it shows for all the lines. So for my labels, basically what I want to do is to center them nicely on each shape, right, or object. So here, I'll just type in the first one, highlight over the space that I want it to center. Instead of merging, right, I'll press Ctrl 1, and then I'll come to alignment. Under horizontal, I'll choose center across selection. Okay, and then I'll click OK. Right, I can put in my border lines, Alt HBO, right, for my bottom border. Okay, so with this, I can now copy the whole of this, paste this in L, paste this in P, paste this in T, and then paste this one here. Okay, so all these, because they have the same shape. Okay, so for our waterfall, that has a wider display. So for that one, I'm just going to come and type income and plus expenses. Okay, we can still apply the same formats, right? So I'll just highlight this, come to home, click the format painter, right? And then just select that whole length. Okay, so it's going to center it nicely. Okay, so I can push this down a bit to allow some space, right? So now that you have this, just know that it is not merged, but it's just centered across your selection, and your labels are in the first cell. So just make changes, call this outflows, right? So this completes our final dashboard. So hopefully you get the idea. So realize that we just Power Query, Power Pivot, and Pivot Tables using our charts and slices. We've been able to achieve this, right?
If this video was helpful and you would like to receive more of these videos directly on your WhatsApp, you can send ad to this WhatsApp number. We'll add you to our broadcast list so you receive our videos directly. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Finance Skills Hub. All our old videos are here. Please subscribe for notification of new videos, or connect with us on any of these social media handles. Thank you so much for watching.